So I recently talked about churches for Christian Universalists, a whole video, a big list of churches in the United States for Christian Universalists to join, different congregations. But for most Christian Universalists, those churches are not an option. So what option do we have? Well, there are really two other options. A, either plant a new church, which I do think is a good idea in some cases, either it be a house church or you rent a building or buy a building, build your own building, whatever. In fact, the first Universalist church in America started out with only 3 members. So I definitely do think it's an option. I do think in some cases it's necessary. But for a lot of Universalists, we're either Lone Rangers or, well, yeah, for most of us, we're just Lone Rangers. So that isn't really an option. You kind of need at least 2 people to start a church. So what option do we have? And I've said before on the channel, I think the most practical course of action for most biblical Universalists is to join a pre-existing denomination congregation that's open to universalism. And I've done a lot of thinking and studying and praying on the matter, and I've been to different churches, a lot of different churches. And I would highly recommend for any Christian Universalist watching, well, if you live in the United States, this doesn't really apply if you don't live in the U.S., to join the United Church of Christ. At least check out a United Church of Christ. Now, you may be asking, what? You're a biblical universalist. Why are you recommending the United Church of Christ? If you know anything about the United Church of Christ, it has a reputation for being incredibly political. Pretty much everything the higher ups of the denomination put out involves politics. Yes, all the major mainline churches are to some degree of political, but the United Church of Christ goes the extra mile with its politics. It's an incredibly political denomination. It's the first to liberalize on issues, and it has a reputation for being the most liberal Protestant denomination in the country. So why would I recommend this denomination to fellow biblical universalists? Well, you see, the United Church of Christ, as it exists on paper, as the higher ups say it is, and the United Church of Christ as it actually exists are two very different denominations. In my opinion, I think the United Church of Christ is one of the best, is not the, it may be the best denomination to plant new universal churches in it. A large part of what I call for on the channel is going into these churches and essentially planting a church in a church. It's kind of like Inception, but you're planting a biblical universalist church in the United Church of Christ. And I'm going to tell you why I think the United Church of Christ isn't as bad as people say. And honestly, I've really come to really like the denomination. I honestly think it has a lot of potential. I honestly think it's one of the better American churches, though it has a bunch of problems. And I really do highly recommend at least visiting a local UCC church. Well, for me, I really started to change my mind on the UCC when I heard about Howard Storm. Howard Storm is a NDE or near-death experiencer, and he's probably the most famous, one of the most famous NDErs around. He has an amazing testimony. He was an atheist for like 25 years. He was born into a Christian household, left when he was like 15, and then left Christianity when he was like 15 or so, and then became an atheist for 20, 25 years. College professor, all that, pretty standard atheist. He was a major atheist. It wasn't really major, but he was a very hedonistic, he said, very atheist. Really powerful story. Highly recommend you look it up. And one thing a lot of people don't know about Howard Storm, and he's reached thousands of people, is that he is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. And I found that really impressive because the last church I would have thought Howard Storm would be an ordained minister in would be the United Church of Christ. The United Church of Christ, said before, very liberal denomination, very far gone. And yet Howard Storm's an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. How he came to the United Church of Christ is quite interesting. He's originally from New England. New England is historically Congregationalist. The United Church of Christ has a bunch of former churches of Congregationalist heritage in them. And he was originally raised in the United Church of Christ. And he said that after he had this NDE, he was going to all these different churches and visiting all these different churches. And he said that he just, like a mile away from the hospital, he found a church, a United Church of Christ, and he said it fit like a glove. That's how he described it. He says, it was the denomination I grew up in, and it fit like a glove. And he just joined the United Church of Christ, and that really stuck with me. The other big reason I really started to kind of change my view on the UCC is I started studying more about Universalist history. As viewers of the channel know, I'm a big Universalist history buff. I'm learning all I can on the Universalist Church and its history. I'm a very big fan of it. And I really respect our Universalist ancestors. They went through so much persecution, and they did so much good. Like, they had so much influence. They did so much good for Christ, and they just did so many amazing things. And it turns out that unlike a lot of other churches, the Congregationalist Church, so today's United Church of Christ, actually has a history with the Universalist Church. Unlike a lot of other churches, the United Church of Christ actually has a real history with the Universalist Church. And for a very long time, the Universalists were in this weird love triangle with the Congregationalists and the Unitarians. Like, it's kind of like a will they, a want they. And back in the 20s, it almost happened that the Universalists merged with the Congregationalists, but the Universalists were worried that, and this was something Universalists were always worried about. They were always worried that they were going to get consumed, they were going to get overran, which is exactly what happened when they merged with the Unitarians. The UU is just the Unitarian Church. They may have the word Unitarian Universalist in the name, but it's really just the Unitarian Church. First president of the Unitarian Universalist Association was the last president of the Unitarian Church. But enough of my little tangent. Back in the 20s, they almost merged. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but that shows that 100 years ago, the Congregationalist Church was similar enough to the Universalist Church that they almost merged. And the United Church of Christ today, I argue, is the true successor denomination to the Universalist Church. If you're a big Universalist history buff like myself, the United Church of Christ of today is very similar to the Universalist Church of yesteryear. Very similar worship, very similar government. And that's when I really started getting to the United Church of Christ, because I'm like, man, these denominations are related. Like, a lot of Universalist churches came out of the Congregationalist tradition. A lot of Universalists came out of the Congregationalist Church. Like the United Church of Christ hails from New England, the Universalist Church hails from New England as well. And they were both very much attached to New England culture. And I say that, of course, as a Southerner. And there's a lot of other similarities. For instance, worship. The United Church of Christ and the Universalist Church both had this middle church worship. They were liturgical, meaning, they would have the Universalists had a prayer book, very similar kind of to the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer. And the United Church of Christ liturgy today is quite similar to the old Universalist liturgy. And probably the biggest similarity is the government. The Universalist Church intentionally based its government off the Congregational Church, where every church is self-governing. In the UCC, and this is a familiar form of government if you grew up Baptist or non-denominational, the church owns the building. They vote for the pastor. The congregation makes the decisions on all sorts of issues. So every church is self-governing, and that's a really big, important deal for joining the UCC. What I have found in my time in the UCC, I've been to several different churches, is the United Church of Christ is not a monolith. I was recently at a very conservative United Church of Christ church. Yes, they do exist. And I was talking with a pastor, and he said that he actually didn't even go to seminary. He just went for this 1 week ordination program. Keep in mind, every church is self-governing. Sometimes churches will make weird exceptions on ordination where they kind of allow some people to get in a bit easier than others. He said he went on this fast track to ordination. Of course, he isn't a pastor for a full-time job. It's like a side gig for him. And he told me when I was talking about the church, he said there's room for all in the UCC, and that really is true. The United Church of Christ is one of the most diverse churches in the country. In the United Church of Christ, you have everything from hyper-conservative Calvinists, which you still do have a lot of Calvinists in the United Church of Christ. I wouldn't say the majority, but they're definitely a minority in the UCC. Everything from hyper-conservative Calvinist churches to Unitarian Universalist churches. Some UCC churches are doubly affiliated with the UUA, which is the Unitarian Church. And it's an incredibly diverse denomination. In my time in the UCC, every congregation's a little different. They kind of all share the same liturgy, similar buildings, but the UCC is a very diverse denomination. Every church is a little bit different. You have some churches that are very evangelical, very Calvinist churches. You have very liberal churches. You have moderate churches. You have hyper liberal churches. All sorts of different churches. It's a very diverse church. And contrary to popular belief on the UCC being hyper liberal, at least according to a 2022 survey, only 1/3 of UCC churches are open and affirming. And the really cool thing about the United Church of Christ is that every congregation, like the UCC, has already made this little sheet. It tells you a little bit of information about it. If you look it up, and it will tell you if it's open and affirming or not. So if you want to know if your local UCC is liberal, you can just look it up. And yes, there are some UCC churches that are open and affirming and very liberal, but for whatever reason aren't marked as open and affirming. But still, if this is true, the majority of the denomination is not open and affirming. The United Church of Christ is generally very open to universalism, 54% of the denomination and something like that. don't believe in a hell. Of course, keep in mind, don't believe in a hell. It varies radically depending on who you're talking to. The UCC is very diverse. There's even Catholics in the UCC, people who identify as Roman Catholic, are part of the Roman Catholic Church, and for whatever reason they attend the United Church of Christ. That's the thing in the UCC. Very diverse denomination, and a really big thing I like about the UCC is its name, the United Church of Christ, United Church of Christ, and I think that's a great name for a denomination. And what's so cool about the UCC is that, remember how I said that it could have had a Universalist heritage, and a few churches in the UCC actually do have a Universalist heritage, like a United Church of Winchester. The UCC has like heritages of multiple different denominations. It has Restorationists, so think Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ. It has Congregationalists, so the Puritans. It also has Lutheran heritage as well. The UCC is a merger of the Christian Congregationalist Church, which itself is a merger of the Congregationalist Church and the Christian Church, which is a Restorationist Church, and the Evangelical and Reformed Church, which is like a Calvinist and a Lutheran kind of church as well. And depending on what part of the country you're in, the UCC, it's going to be very different. Typically, the churches that are Congregationalist, so there are some more conservative Congregationalist churches, are a lot more liberal. Like the most liberal part of the UCC is New England, which isn't very surprising. Meanwhile, churches that are more evangelical and reformed in their heritage are a bit more conservative typically. But the United Church of Christ, I really find it so cool is that they are the United Church of Christ, and they have a big emphasis that all may be one. The UCC takes seriously when Jesus talked about he wants his disciples to be one. Like that's the whole reason the United Church of Christ exists. They take that command very seriously, and they're also very ecumenical with other denominations. They have common mission statements with multiple different denominations. And even though this saying in the UCC is often used for more, liberal intent, it is still a big part of the United Church of Christ theology, and that is God is still speaking. Now, of course, that's typically used by more liberal ministers, but it still is quite interesting to think. A lot of denominations don't really think that way. Like God is still talking, God is still speaking, and I really do like that idea. I do believe God is still speaking in the current day, and I do appreciate the United Church of Christ, even though it's incredibly liberal, does still believe that. I really don't think the United Church of Christ is as bad as people say. I've been to a lot of UCC churches. I've spent time in the UCC. I don't really think it's that bad. In fact, I think it's a denomination with a lot of promise. A lot of what I talk about on the channel is going into a church that's open to universalism, kind of view every church kind of like it's a garden, and you're carrying the seeds of universal salvation. Some churches are better ground than others, and I think the United Church of Christ is probably one of the most fertile grounds for your average Christian Universalist. You see, with other liberal denominations, most of them have a different form of government. The best form of government and the historic form of government for Universalists is the Congregationalist government, where every congregation is self-governing. That's a big part of Universalist heritage. And I think that's most in line with what we should be doing, because Universalists, we've always been a very diverse bunch, and I think the congregation should decide for itself on a bunch of different issues, because Universalists have always been so diverse on a lot of different ideas. And with other denominations like the ELCA, the Episcopal Church, the PCUSA, United Methodist, all these denominations, to varying degrees, are open to universalism. Some are more open than others. But they have a form of government that makes it a lot harder to reform the church in a biblical universalist direction. Meanwhile, with a church like the Disciples of Christ, they're very open to universalism. The disciples don't believe in creeds and stuff. Pretty much, you can't make a church officially Christian Universalist in the disciples. Like, you can only, I guess if you really did take over the congregation, but there are no Disciples of Christ, to my knowledge, that are officially Christian Universalists. Even more like David Artman preaches, I don't think his church is actually officially Christian Universalist. But the United Church of Christ has several churches that are affiliated with the Christian Universalist Association, several churches that are Unitarian Universalists and are still Christian. I think of course, the United Winchester Church, or the Church of Sterling in Massachusetts. And there are a lot of UCC churches that are Christian Universalists. In fact, Love Unrelenting has a video called Universalism in the United Church of Christ. And the UCC is just a very open to universalism denomination, but it isn't as bad as people say. Like, in my time in the United Church of Christ, it really isn't as bad as people think. So it's a denomination with a lot of problems, but I think Christians are supposed to be soldiers into a dark world, especially as Christian Universalists. I think we are. And the United Church of Christ has a bunch of problems, but at least the UCC is open, that it has a bunch of problems. Like the United Church of Christ, it's a very flawed denomination, but you can like see the flaws. Like a lot of churches, I feel like they're so Pharisaic that they try to hide their flaws. They try to hide the flaws in their people. Like the UCC is a lot more honest. That it's just a bunch of broken people. And not to say the United Church of Christ is perfect. It's very political. Like the denomination's YouTube channel is just politics, politics, politics. I just can't stand political preaching because I mean, like every Sunday in the pulpit, you've got to hear about politics, and it gets very tiring. But we have to remember that the most important thing you get from church is the means of grace, the sacraments and the word and worship. Christ said, when 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am with them. Communion and baptism and the other sacraments are, of course, means of grace. And the reading of the Bible is also a means of grace. These things are what spiritually feed us. So even if the pastor's, you're still getting the means of grace. And also another thing I've really found with the United Church of Christ is that even churches that have pretty much most of the problems with the United Church of Christ are the higher ups, the seminaries. Like most of the problems with the UCC are with pastors and the seminaries, and not even really so much pastors. In fact, there is a conservative movement in the United Church of Christ, and there's a moderate movement, and there is a biblical universalist movement in the United Church of Christ. There's a lot of different movements in the United Church of Christ. What I've found is that the United Church of Christ, its problem is its pastors and its seminaries. A lot of churches, even churches that have like a pride flag and are very liberal, you'll find people on the pews that are not liberal, or at the very least are open to different perspectives and stuff. It's often a problem with the pastors and the leadership of a church. And what I've found is that if we can get biblical, a lot of what I call for on the channel is getting involved, like in a church, becoming a active member, preaching biblical universalism. And pretty much what I say is that at least in some cases, you'll be able to guide them in a more biblical universalist direction. Hopefully, ultimately getting them to join the Christian Universalist Association. When it comes to pastors, there are still some pastors that are hyper political in the UCC. That's an option. Keep in mind the UCC also has those common mission statements, so you can get a pastor from like the ELCA or the United Methodist, which are much more tame by comparison to the United Church of Christ. Or you can even get yourself ordained. I talked about that minister I talked about. He only got like ordained like a week. In the United Church of Christ, keep in mind every church is self-governing. So you can definitely have some influence, maybe become a pastor, not as hard as you think. And keep in mind the UCC is desperate for membership. A really interesting fact about the UCC is that at the current time, the UCC is about the same size as the Universalist Church was at its height. Of course, the United Church of Christ has declined from about 2 million at its founding in 1957, to about 770,000 now. The Universalist Church peaked at about 800,000. So that's just a really interesting parallel. You can probably find a United Church of Christ near you. And keep in mind, I would just recommend visiting a United Church of Christ. That's what I'm really saying. If you just visit your local UCC church, give it a chance. I know the United Church of Christ has a bunch of problems, but it is a savable denomination. Like out of all the denominations in the United States that can be reformed for biblical universalism, I think the United Church of Christ is the most open to biblical universalism. I think it can be reformed for biblical universalism. Does the UCC have a bunch of problems? Absolutely. But is it savable? Absolutely. Has a bunch of problems, but one person really can make a difference inside a local UCC congregation. And if you are part of a house church or whatever that is Christian Universalist, I would recommend your whole group looking into a local UCC church, because you would be able to turn the church even quicker that way. So yeah, the United Church of Christ has a bunch of problems, very flawed denomination. But there's also a lot of stuff to really like. The church does a bunch of charity work. They also have grape juice communion, which I personally am a fan of because alcoholism is unfortunately a fairly major problem in our society. So I do admire that everybody can come to the table without fear. I really like the UCC's liturgy. It's actually like a lot less political than like the ELCA's liturgy. I've been to ELCA churches, like the liturgy is actually quite political, but the United Church of Christ, the liturgy is a lot more tame. It's actually not so political. And really, I just like the United Church of Christ. And the really nice thing about it is that congregational government. I've talked with liberals in the denomination, I've talked with conservatives, and they all really like that congregational government. The church governs themselves, and that means that the church decides what pastor they have, they decide their leaders. It's all up to the congregation. And if you are one person, especially a person like below 50, and you have a lot of charisma, and you just preach, you be a light, like you can have so much influence. I cannot underestimate this enough. Like you can have so much influence in your local UCC. Also, I just really like that name. I love that name, United Church of Christ. I think it's just, it's a beautiful name. I think it's just a beautiful idea behind the denomination like this, bringing together the Christian world, even though it has a bunch of flaws. I think the United Church of Christ, there's a lot to admire. Well, y'all have a good day. God bless. And please check out your local UCC church, even if it has a bunch of flaws. Like, subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and Christ will conquer.